The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Arizona, in 1876, causing Preston Thornton to duck instinctively before realizing he wasn't the target. The notorious gunslinger straightened his tall frame and adjusted his black Stetson, cold blue eyes scanning the chaotic scene before him. Preston's reputation preceded him. Wherever he went they said he had killed 20 men, that he slept with one eye open, and most persistently, that he would never marry. "Damn fool," Preston muttered, watching as the town drunk was dragged away by the sheriff after firing wildly into the air. He turned toward the saloon, his usual haunt, when a commotion from the general store caught his attention. "You can't just raise prices without warning, Mr. Hopkins." A woman's voice, strong and clear despite its obvious distress, carried across the street. Preston shouldn't have looked. He had made it a rule never to get involved in other people's problems. But something in that voice pulled his gaze toward the store's entrance, where a slender woman in black stood toe-to-toe with old Hopkins, the store owner. "Times are hard, Mrs. Winters. The drought's affecting everyone." "I got mouths to feed too," Hopkins replied, his wheedling tone grating on Preston's ears even from across the street. "My children have mouths too, and they're getting hungrier by the day," the woman retorted, her auburn hair gleaming in the afternoon sun as it escaped from beneath her black bonnet. Preston found himself moving closer, drawn by some force he couldn't name. The woman, Mrs. Winters, Hopkins had called her, clutched a piece of paper in one hand and a small purse in the other. A widow, judging by her black dress. Another soul left to fend for herself in this unforgiving territory. "Perhaps I could be of assistance," Preston heard himself say, surprised by his own intervention. Both Hopkins and Mrs. Winters turned toward him, their expressions changing instantly as recognition dawned. Hopkins paled, while the widow's green eyes narrowed. "Mr. Thornton," Hopkins stammered. "Didn't see you there." "Evidently," Preston replied coolly. "What seems to be the problem?" Before Hopkins could answer, Mrs. Winters spoke. "The problem, sir, is that Mr. Hopkins has decided to double the price of flour without warning, when I've already promised to bake pies for the church social to raise money for my children's schooling." Preston studied her face. Most people cowered in his presence, but this woman met his gaze steadily, grief and determination etched into the fine lines around her eyes. She couldn't be more than 25, yet life had clearly dealt her a difficult hand. "Hopkins," Preston said, not looking away from the widow, "what was the price of flour last week?" $2 for 20 pounds, but then it remains $2 today," Preston interrupted. "And you'll throw in 5 pounds of sugar for Mrs. Winters." "Katherine Winters," she supplied, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "And I don't need charity, Mr. Thornton, especially not from a man of your reputation." The corner of Preston's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it that had crossed his face in years. "It's not charity, Mrs. Winters. It's justice. Hopkins here has been overcharging everyone in town for years. I'm simply evening the score." Hopkins sputtered but quickly gathered the flour and sugar when Preston's hand casually drifted toward the revolver on his hip. The store owner thrust the goods into Katherine's arms with a scowl. "Thank you," Katherine said stiffly, addressing Hopkins rather than Preston. Then, unexpectedly, she turned those remarkable green eyes on him. "Mr. Thornton, I don't approve of intimidation even when it benefits me. But my children will eat better tonight because of your intervention, so I thank you for that." She walked away, her back straight and her head high, leaving Preston staring after her. Something stirred within him, something he thought had died years ago, buried beneath the weight of countless violent encounters and lonely nights. "She's got spirit, that one," a voice said beside him. Preston turned to find Sheriff Larson leaning against a hitching post, watching him with knowing eyes. "Seems so," Preston replied neutrally. "Husband died in a mining accident 6 months ago, left her with 3 young ones and a mountain of debt. She's been scraping by, taking in washing and baking for folks." The sheriff straightened. "Word of advice, Thornton, that woman's got enough troubles without adding you to the list." Preston's jaw tightened. "I was just passing by. See that you keep it that way," Larson said. "This town respects you for keeping the peace during the Sullivan Gang incident, but folks are nervous having you around. They say—" "I know what they say," Preston cut him off. "And I don't give a damn." He stalked off toward the saloon, irritated by the sheriff's presumption and even more irritated by his own reaction to Katherine Winters. He hadn't felt that strange pull, that curiosity about another human being, in longer than he could remember. Inside the dim interior of the Lucky Strike saloon, Preston took his usual corner table back to the wall, facing the entrance. He ordered whiskey and drank it slowly, trying to push the widow from his mind. It didn't work. Throughout the evening, as cowboys and miners filled the saloon with noise and smoke, Preston found himself thinking about Katherine Winters, about the flash of fire in her eyes, the determined set of her chin, the way she'd stood her ground despite her precarious situation. The following morning, Preston rose early, as was his habit. He had no particular business in Redemption Creek. He'd arrived a week ago, intending to rest his horse and move on. But something kept him lingering, something he wasn't ready to name. He walked to the small cafe near the hotel and was halfway through his breakfast when the door opened, admitting Katherine Winters and 3 children. The oldest, a boy of about 10, held his mother's hand while keeping a protective eye on his younger sisters, who appeared to be around 6 and 4. Preston watched as they took a table by the window. Katherine was scanning the menu with a slight frown, clearly calculating costs. When the waitress came, she ordered 1 plate of flapjacks and 4 forks. Without thinking, Preston signaled the waitress over. "Add another 3 plates to that order," he said quietly, sliding her enough money to cover the meals and a generous tip. "And don't tell them where it came from." The waitress raised an eyebrow but nodded. A few minutes later, she delivered 4 full plates to the Winters family. Preston watched as Katherine's face registered confusion, then suspicion as she questioned the waitress. The server simply shrugged and moved on to another table. Katherine's eyes scanned the cafe until they locked with Preston's. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and after saying something to her children, she rose and approached his table. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice low, "I believe I have you to thank for our unexpected bounty this morning." "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Winters," Preston replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Please don't insult my intelligence." She placed both hands on his table and leaned closer. "I told you yesterday that I don't accept charity." "And I told you it wasn't charity," he countered. "Consider it an investment in the future of Redemption Creek. Well-fed children learn better, and educated children build better communities." She studied him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Thornton." "And what did you expect, Mrs. Winters?" "A cold-blooded killer with no conscience. That's what they say you are." Preston's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "People say a lot of things." Katherine straightened. "My husband believed in looking beyond rumors to find the truth about a person." "It seems I've forgotten that lesson." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for the breakfast. My children are grateful even if their mother is too proud." As she turned to go, Preston surprised himself again. "Mrs. Winters, perhaps I could call on you sometime. Properly, I mean." Katherine looked back at him, genuine shock registering on her face. "Mr. Thornton, do you know what people would say?" I thought we'd established that I don't care what people say. A small smile touched her lips. Sunday, after church, we'll be home by 1 o'clock. With that, she returned to her children, leaving Preston to wonder what the hell he was doing. Word spread quickly in Redemption Creek. By noon, Preston had endured countless stares and whispers as he went about his business. By evening, when he entered the saloon, the usual hum of conversation died completely. "Well, look who's hunting widows now," called a voice from the bar. Hank Miller, a local rancher with more money than sense, stood swaying slightly, a whiskey in hand. "Ain't that something, boys?" The great Preston Thornton, thinking he can court a decent woman. Preston ignored him, heading for his usual table. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Miller's voice rose. "What makes you think Katherine Winters would look twice at a murderer like you? She needs a real man, someone who can provide for her and those kids." Preston sat down, his face impassive. The bartender nervously placed a whiskey in front of him, then scurried away. Miller wasn't finished. "They say you killed your own brother in cold blood. That true, Thornton? That why you wander from town to town? No woman would ever tie herself to a man like you." In one fluid motion, Preston was on his feet, his revolver pointed directly at Miller's chest. The saloon fell deathly silent. "My brother died defending me from men who wanted us both dead," Preston said, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the room. "I've killed men, yes, but only those who needed killing." He holstered his weapon. "Speak of Mrs. Winters again, and I'll show you firsthand the difference between rumors and reality." He tossed money on the table and walked out, his whiskey untouched. Outside, the cool night air filled his lungs. Preston walked without direction, eventually finding himself near the small white church on the edge of town. Beside it stood a modest house, the parsonage, he assumed. Light glowed in the windows, and as he paused, the door opened. Katherine Winters stepped onto the porch, saying goodbye to someone inside. When she turned and saw Preston standing in the shadows, she froze. "Mr. Thornton, what are you doing here?" "Evening walk," he replied, stepping into the pool of light cast by the porch lantern. "I didn't mean to startle you." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I was helping Reverend Collins prepare for Sunday service." An awkward silence stretched between them. "May I walk you home?" Preston finally asked. Katherine hesitated, then nodded. "It's not far." They walked side by side through the quiet streets. The moonlight silvered Katherine's hair where it peeked from beneath her bonnet, and Preston found himself stealing glances at her profile. "I heard what happened at the saloon," she said suddenly. Preston stiffened. "News travels fast. It's a small town." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Was it true? About your brother?" Preston hadn't spoken of Patrick in years, but something about the gentle inquiry in Katherine's voice loosened the knot in his chest. "Yes, we were ambushed by a gang we'd had trouble with before. Patrick took a bullet meant for me. I killed the men responsible." "I'm sorry," she said simply. "It was a long time ago." They resumed walking, and Preston felt the weight of her consideration. "My husband, Daniel, died trying to save another miner when the support beams collapsed," Katherine said softly. "People called him a hero. They call you a killer for doing essentially the same thing, protecting those you care about." Preston had no response to that. They reached a small, weathered house at the edge of town. A lantern burned in the window. "Mrs. Browning stays with the children when I'm out," Katherine explained, stopping at the gate. "Mr. Thornton, Preston, I should warn you, people are already talking about your interest in me." "It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," he replied. She studied him in the moonlight. "They say you'll never settle down, that you're not the marrying kind." "They say a lot of things," he repeated his earlier words. Catherine's mouth curved into a small smile. Until Sunday, then. Preston watched her enter the house before turning away, his mind in turmoil. What was he doing, pursuing a respectable widow with 3 children? He had no roots, no future to offer. Just a bloody past and a reputation that would follow him and, by extension, her wherever they went. Yet as he returned to his hotel room, Preston couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he was thinking beyond the next day, the next town. Sunday came both too quickly and not quickly enough. Preston attended church, causing a ripple of surprise through the congregation when he slipped into a back pew. Reverend Collins, to his credit, showed no reaction beyond a welcoming nod before beginning his sermon on redemption and second chances. Throughout the service, Preston was acutely aware of Katherine sitting several rows ahead, her children beside her. The oldest boy, James, Preston had learned, kept turning to look at him with undisguised curiosity. The younger girls, Emma and Sarah, followed their brother's gaze once or twice but seemed more interested in their picture books. After the service, Preston waited outside while Katherine spoke with other parishioners. The reactions were mixed. Some smiled and chatted normally, while others cast disapproving glances between her and Preston. "Mr. Thornton," a small voice called. Preston looked down to find Emma Winters standing before him, her ribbon slightly askew in her light brown hair. "Are you coming to our house for dinner? Mama made a pie." Before Preston could answer, Katherine appeared, looking flustered. "Emma, I told you to wait with James and Sarah." She gave Preston an apologetic look. Children have a way of racing ahead of propriety. "I don't mind," Preston said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "And yes, Emma, I would be honored to join you for dinner if the invitation stands." Katherine's expression softened. "It does." The walk to the Winters' home was filled with Emma's chatter, while James maintained a watchful silence and little Sarah hid partially behind her mother's skirts. Preston found himself relaxing in their presence, answering Emma's endless questions about his travels with more patience than he'd shown anyone in years. Dinner was simple but delicious, a hearty stew, fresh bread, and the promised apple pie. Preston watched as Katherine moved efficiently around the small kitchen, directing her children to help set the table and serve the food. There was a gentle rhythm to their interactions, a comfortable routine that spoke of love and resilience in the face of loss. "Mr. Thornton," James said suddenly as they ate. "Why do people say you're dangerous, James?" Katherine admonished. "That's not appropriate dinner conversation." Preston raised a hand. "It's all right." He looked directly at the boy. "I've had to defend myself and others over the years. Sometimes that meant using my gun. People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand men like me who live by their own code." James nodded seriously. "My pa had a code too. He said a man should always protect those who can't protect themselves." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Preston said, his throat unexpectedly tight. "He was," Katherine said softly, "and he would have appreciated your honesty with our son." After dinner, while the children cleared the table, Preston and Katherine sat on the small front porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. "Thank you for coming today," Katherine said. "It meant a lot to the children. They've missed having a man's presence in the house." Preston shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure I'm the kind of presence they need." "Perhaps that's not for you to decide," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked at her. The grief was still there in her eyes, but it didn't define her. There was strength too, and warmth, and something else, a challenge. "Katherine," he said, the first time he'd used her given name, "I should be moving on soon. I don't usually stay in one place this long, I know. But I find myself, Reluctant to leave, she met his gaze steadily. "People will talk. Let them. They'll say I'm a fool to welcome a gunslinger into my home, into my children's lives." "Are you?" he asked softly. Catherine's hand found his on the porch railing. "My husband taught me to trust my instincts. And my instincts tell me there's more to Preston Thornton than ghost stories and wanted posters." A commotion from the street interrupted the moment. Sheriff Larson was approaching rapidly on horseback, followed by several mounted men. "Thornton," the sheriff called, reining in at the gate. "Need to talk to you." Preston stood, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "Sullivan gang, they're back." Larson's face was grim. "3 of them hit the bank in Silver Creek yesterday. Word is they're headed this way." A cold weight settled in Preston's stomach. The Sullivan gang, the same men responsible for his brother's death. He'd killed their leader, Frank Sullivan, years ago, but Frank's brothers had escaped. "Mrs. Winters," Larson tipped his hat. "Beg pardon for the interruption." Katherine had risen to stand beside Preston. "No apology necessary, Sheriff. Is the town in danger?" "Potentially, madam. The Sullivans have a score to settle with Thornton here, and they're not known for their discretion." Preston's mind was already racing. "How many men can you deputize?" "Got 5 volunteers already," Larson replied. "But we could use someone with your experience." Preston turned to Katherine, whose face had gone pale. "I should go," she nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Be careful." As Preston moved to follow the sheriff, Katherine suddenly caught his arm. "Preston," her voice was low, meant only for him. "I'm not afraid of you. I never was. But I am afraid for you." Something in her words, in the naked concern on her face, pierced straight through the armor Preston had built around his heart. Without thinking, he drew her close and pressed his lips to hers, a brief, fierce kiss that held the promise of return. "I'll be back," he said. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Preston helped Larson position men around town, focusing on the bank, the main street, and at Preston's insistence the area near Katherine's home. Word went out for women and children to stay indoors, and by nightfall, Redemption Creek had taken on the eerie quiet of a town holding its breath. Preston didn't sleep. He maintained his vigil from the roof of the hotel, which offered a clear view of the main approaches to town. As dawn broke, he spotted what he'd been waiting for, a dust cloud on the eastern road. The warning shot fired by a deputy stationed at the edge of town gave the citizens of Redemption Creek just enough time to seek shelter. Preston moved swiftly through back alleys to his designated position behind the bank. The Sullivan gang, 8 men in total, more than expected, rode into town with guns blazing, clearly hoping to draw Preston out. Instead, they were met with organized resistance from multiple positions. The ensuing gunfight was brief but intense. Preston took down 2 of the gang members from his hidden position before Tom Sullivan, the eldest surviving brother, spotted him. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the buildings of Redemption Creek, each man hunting the other with the patience of experienced killers. They finally confronted each other in the dusty street in front of the general store. Tom Sullivan, a bear of a man with a face scarred from countless fights, leveled his revolver at Preston. "You killed my brother," Sullivan growled. "After he killed mine," Preston replied, his own weapon steady in his hand. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "Heard you've gone soft, Thornton, getting cozy with a widow and her brats." Rage flashed through Preston, but he controlled it, knowing Sullivan was trying to provoke him into making a mistake. "It's over, Tom. Your men are dead or captured. Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial." Sullivan's laugh was ugly. "Like hell, but I ain't going alone." With surprising speed, he shifted his aim toward something behind Preston. Preston turned just enough to see Katherine standing in the doorway of the general store, a look of horror on her face. In that split second of distraction, Sullivan fired. Pain exploded in Preston's left shoulder, spinning him half around. But even as he fell to one knee, his own revolver spoke once, twice. Tom Sullivan staggered backward, a look of disbelief crossing his features before he collapsed in the dirt. Preston, Katherine was running toward him, heedless of the danger. Preston fought to stay conscious as she reached him, her hands pressing against his wound to stem the bleeding. "Foolish woman," he managed through gritted teeth. "Could have been killed." "So could you," she retorted, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare die on me, Preston Thornton. Not when I've just found you." Those were the last words Preston heard before darkness claimed him. He woke to the sensation of a cool cloth on his forehead and the soft murmur of voices. Opening his eyes, Preston found himself in an unfamiliar room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. As his vision cleared, he recognized Katherine sitting beside the bed, her head bowed in what appeared to be prayer. "If you're negotiating with the Almighty for my soul, I'm afraid you're too late," Preston said, his voice rough. "It's been lost for years." Katherine's head snapped up, relief flooding her features. "Preston, thank God." She pressed the back of her hand to his cheek. "The fever broke. Dr. Morgan said if you made it through the night, you'd likely recover." Preston attempted to sit up and was rewarded with a sharp pain in his shoulder. Katherine gently pushed him back against the pillows. "Don't try to move yet. The bullet went clean through, but you lost a lot of blood." Memories of the gunfight filtered back. "Sullivan, dead," she confirmed. "Along with 4 of his men, the others were captured." Preston looked around the room, recognizing it now as the main bedroom of Katherine's house. "Why am I here and not at the doctor's?" A slight flush colored Katherine's cheeks. "I insisted. Dr. Morgan agreed you could be moved once he treated the wound, and I wanted you where I could care for you properly." "What about your reputation?" Preston asked, although he couldn't deny the warmth that spread through him at her words. "My reputation." Katherine's laugh held a note of disbelief. "Preston, you saved the town. You're a hero now, not a villain." "Heroes don't have blood on their hands," he said quietly. Katherine's expression grew serious. "Sometimes they do. Sometimes the line between hero and villain is just a matter of perspective." She took his hand in both of hers. "The children have been asking about you constantly. Emma's made you a get-well card, and James has been telling everyone at school that his mother's beau is the bravest man in the territory." Preston's heart stuttered at the word beau. "Is that what I am? Your beau?" Katherine's smile was both shy and determined. "That depends. Are you still planning to move on once you're healed?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Preston had spent years drifting, never allowing himself to form attachments, always moving before the darkness of his past could catch up to him. But looking at Katherine now, he realized that somewhere between their first meeting and this moment, everything had changed. "No," he said finally. "Not unless you want me to." "I don't," Katherine replied simply. "The children don't either." Preston swallowed against the emotion rising in his throat. "I'm not an easy man, Katherine. I've lived a hard life, made enemies. The Sullivans won't be the last to come looking for me. I know." She squeezed his hand. "When Daniel died, I thought my life was over. I've spent 6 months just surviving, going through the motions for the children's sake. Then you walked into the general store and stood up for me, and something woke up inside me again." Her green eyes held his steadily. "I told you before, I'm not afraid of you, Preston Thornton. And I'm not afraid of what loving you might bring." The word loving hung in the air between them, bold and undeniable. "Katherine," Preston's voice was rough with emotion, "I don't deserve this, you, the children, a home." Deserve has nothing to do with it, she replied. Love isn't earned, it's given, and I'm giving mine to you if you want it. Preston reached up with his good arm, drawing her down until their foreheads touched. I want it more than I've ever wanted anything. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. When they finally parted, Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. They said you would never marry, she whispered, that you were too dangerous, too damaged. Preston smiled, a real smile that transformed his features. They say a lot of things, but they don't know what I know now. And what's that? That some souls are meant to find each other, no matter how unlikely it seems. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You stole my soul the moment you stood up to Hopkins in that store, Katherine Winters. I've been yours ever since. 3 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Preston Thornton stood in the small church of Redemption Creek, watching as Katherine walked toward him in a dress of pale blue silk. James stood proudly at Preston's side as best man, while Emma and Sarah preceded their mother down the aisle, scattering flower petals with enthusiastic abandon. The townspeople filled the pews, their earlier suspicion replaced by a grudging, then genuine acceptance as Preston had proven himself in the weeks following the Sullivan gang incident. He'd used his reward money from an old bounty to buy the struggling livery stable, partnering with James to restore it to profitability. He'd hung up his guns, though one remained locked in a drawer by the bed, a concession to Catherine's practical nature and his own past. As Reverend Collins began the ceremony, Preston looked into Catherine's radiant face and marveled at the journey that had brought him here. From a lonely gunslinger with a death wish to a man with a family, a business, and a future. They said you would never marry, Katherine whispered as they exchanged rings, a mischievous glint in her eye. They were wrong about a lot of things, Preston replied, slipping the gold band onto her finger. But most of all, they were wrong about second chances. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Preston pulled Katherine into his arms and kissed her deeply, heedless of the chuckles and applause from the congregation. Emma and Sarah hugged their legs, while James looked on with approving pride. Preston Thornton, the man who would never marry, had found his home at last in the arms of a widow who wasn't afraid of his past, in the love of children who saw only his future, and in a town that had given him the chance to become the man he was always meant to be. Outside the church, as they emerged into the golden afternoon light, Katherine leaned into her new husband's embrace. Where to now, Mr. Thornton? Preston smiled down at her, at the children dancing around them, at the life they would build together. Home, Mrs. Thornton. Where I've always belonged.